The early morning fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean, covering Portland's Dockyard in a thick blanket of gray mist. Staff Sergeant James Cooper stood at the bus stop, his military duffel bag at his feet, watching the cargo ships slowly appear and disappear in the distance. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, the peaceful scene before him felt almost unreal. James was 32 years old, with short brown hair that still maintained its military precision and alert green eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings, a habit he couldn't shake even after leaving the battlefield. His muscular frame was hidden under a simple civilian outfit, blue jeans, a black t-shirt, and a brown leather jacket that had seen better days. The job offer as a security supervisor at Portland Dockyard had come at the perfect time. His sister Sarah, who worked in the Dockyard's administrative office, had told him about the position 2 months before his discharge. "It's perfect for you, James," she had written in her email. "Quiet enough to help you adjust, but structured enough to feel familiar." As James walked through the Dockyard's main gate, his new security badge clipped to his jacket, several workers nodded in greeting. A few of them were veterans themselves. He could tell by the way they carried themselves and the knowing looks they gave him. The familiar sight of men and women going about their daily work brought a small smile to his face. Mr. Peterson, the head of security, met James outside the main office building. He was a short, round man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes behind thick glasses. "Welcome aboard, Staff Sergeant Cooper," he said, extending his hand. "Or should I just call you James now?" "James is fine, sir," he replied, shaking the offered hand firmly. "No need for sir here," Peterson chuckled. "Come on, let me show you around. Your sister speaks highly of you, and your military record is impressive. We need someone with your experience to tighten things up around here." As they walked through the Dockyard, Peterson explained the layout. The facility sprawled across 50 acres, with 3 main piers, numerous warehouses, and a maze of cargo containers that created narrow corridors throughout the yard. James noticed several security cameras were broken or pointed in useless directions, and some of the fence sections needed repair. "Night shift has been having some problems lately," Peterson admitted as they reached the security office. "Nothing major, some vandalism, a few break-in attempts. But the workers are getting nervous. That's why we wanted someone with real experience." Inside the office, James met his team, 4 security guards who would work under his supervision. They seemed relieved to have someone with military background in charge. One of them, Mike Williams, a former police officer in his 40s, pulled James aside after the introductions. "Listen, boss," Mike said in a low voice, "there's something you should know. We've been having trouble with a local motorcycle gang. They call themselves the Harbor Kings. Started showing up about 6 months ago. Nothing we can prove yet, but we think they're using the Dockyard for smuggling operations." James nodded, taking in the information without showing any reaction. His military training had taught him to observe first, act later. "Tell me everything you know about them," he said quietly. As Mike described the gang's activities, James felt a familiar sensation in his gut, the same one he used to get before missions in Afghanistan. This wasn't going to be the quiet job his sister had promised, but maybe that was for the best. After 15 years in the military, he wasn't sure he knew how to do quiet anymore. The rest of the morning passed quickly as James learned the security protocols, studied the patrol routes, and memorized the Dockyard layout. By lunchtime, he had already started forming plans to improve the security system. This place needed work, but he was good at fixing broken things. As James sat in the break room with his coffee, watching workers and trucks move through the Dockyard, he felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the military: purpose. He might not be in Afghanistan anymore, but there were still things worth protecting here. Little did he know, his military training would be put to the test sooner than he expected. After 2 weeks on the job, James Cooper began to notice patterns in the Harbor Kings' activities. The motorcycle gang always showed up in groups of 3 or 4, usually between midnight and 3 a.m., when the Dockyard was at its quietest. Their bikes were custom Harley-Davidsons, painted black with red crowns, their gang symbol. One night, while checking the security cameras in his office, James spotted 3 bikes parked behind Warehouse B. He grabbed his flashlight and radio, then headed out to investigate. The autumn air was cold, and his boots made soft sounds on the concrete as he walked between the tall stacks of cargo containers. As he turned the corner, he saw Bobby Chen, one of the night shift workers, talking to a large man in a leather jacket. The biker had long black hair tied in a ponytail and a thick beard. A patch on his jacket identified him as Razor, the gang's leader. When they noticed James approaching, Bobby quickly walked away, pretending to be busy with his clipboard. "Evening," James said calmly, his flashlight beam pointed at the ground. His military training told him to keep his distance while staying aware of his surroundings. He could hear two more bikers moving behind the containers, trying to circle around him. Razor smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Well, if it isn't the new security chief. We've heard about you, soldier boy." He pulled out a pack of cigarettes and lit one, acting like he owned the place. "Nice night for a walk, isn't it?" James noticed a small package being passed between other workers and the bikers in the shadows. He pretended not to see it, but made mental notes of everyone involved. "This is private property," he said. "Unless you have business here, I'll have to ask you to leave." Razor laughed, blowing smoke into the air. "Business? Oh, we have lots of business here. Ask around. Everybody knows the Harbor Kings. We help keep things running smoothly." He patted his jacket pocket, and James heard the sound of money rustling. Through careful observation, James had learned that the gang was bribing workers to look the other way while they used the dockyard for smuggling. They would hide their illegal goods in legitimate cargo containers, then have corrupt workers help move them out during regular shipments. The next day, James called a meeting with his security team. Mike Williams, a former cop, brought coffee for everyone as they gathered in the small office. "The situation is worse than we thought," James explained, showing them photos he'd taken of the gang members and their activities. "They got at least 5 workers on their payroll, maybe more. They're using our night shifts to move their goods through the port." Sarah, his sister, knocked on the office door during the meeting. Her face was worried as she handed James a report. "You need to see this," she said quietly. 3 workers quit this week. They'd all say it's for personal reasons, but I think they're scared." James studied the report. The workers who quit were all good employees with years of experience. The gang was slowly taking control of the night shift by pushing out honest workers and replacing them with people they could bribe or threaten. Later that evening, James found graffiti sprayed on his car, a red crown with a warning message. "Back off, soldier boy." He took photos of the vandalism but didn't report it. Getting the police involved too early might make the gang more careful and harder to catch. Instead, James started mapping out the gang's movements. He marked their usual routes, noted which workers they talked to, and recorded the times they appeared. The military had taught him that information was as powerful as any weapon. He also began making changes to the security system. New cameras were installed in blind spots, broken fences were repaired, and patrol routes were changed randomly to make them unpredictable. The Harbor Kings noticed these changes. James could tell by the angry looks Razor gave him whenever their paths crossed. One night, as James watched the gang members through his binoculars from the roof of Warehouse C, he knew things would come to a head soon. The Harbor Kings weren't used to being challenged, and they wouldn't give up their territory without a fight, but neither would he. This dockyard was his responsibility now, and he had sworn to protect it. The clock struck midnight as James Cooper made his usual rounds through the dockyard. The October wind carried the smell of salt water and diesel fuel. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he walked between rows of cargo containers, checking for anything unusual. Suddenly, he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycle engines. 3 bikes appeared, their headlights off, moving slowly through the maze of containers. James switched off his flashlight and stepped into the shadows, his combat instincts taking over. He could hear metal scraping against metal. Someone was trying to break into one of the containers. Moving silently, the way he had learned in Afghanistan, James made his way closer to the sound. 3 men in leather jackets were working on container 247B. One held a flashlight, while another used tools to break the lock. The third man kept watch, a baseball bat resting on his shoulder. "Hey," James called out, stepping into view. His voice was firm and commanding, the same tone he had used with his soldiers. "Drop those tools. You're trespassing on private property." The 3 bikers turned to face him. The largest one, holding the baseball bat, laughed. "Look what we got here, boys. It's the famous soldier everyone's talking about." He swung the bat playfully. "Nice uniform, rent-a-cop. Does it come with plastic badges?" James stood his ground, his hands relaxed at his sides. He recognized these men from his surveillance. They were part of Razor's inner circle. The tall one with the bat was called Snake, the one with the tools went by Dazel, and the third, a skinny man with tattoos covering his neck, was known as Twitch. "I'm giving you one warning," James said calmly. "Leave now, or there will be consequences." His eyes scanned the area, noting possible escape routes and potential weapons, just as he had been trained to do. Snake stepped forward, trying to use his size to intimidate James. "One warning? Who do you think you are, soldier boy? This is our territory. Maybe you need a lesson in respect." He raised the bat threateningly. James didn't move. He had faced much worse in Afghanistan, insurgents with real weapons, not thugs with baseball bats. "Your choice," he said quietly. "But remember, I warned you." Snake swung the bat at James's head, but the former soldier wasn't there anymore. James stepped inside the swing, grabbed the bat with one hand, and drove his other elbow into Snake's solar plexus. The big man doubled over, losing his grip on the bat. James tossed it far away into the darkness. Dazel rushed forward with a wrench, but James was ready. Using the close-quarters combat techniques he had mastered in the military, he blocked the attack and swept Diesel's legs out from under him. The biker crashed hard onto the concrete. Twitch pulled out a switchblade, his hands shaking. "You're dead, man. The Kings are gonna tear you apart." He slashed wildly at James, but his attacks were amateur and predictable. James caught Twitch's wrist, applied pressure to the right point, and the knife clattered to the ground. A quick twist put the biker face down on the concrete, his arm locked behind his back. "Stay down," James ordered, and to emphasize his point, he applied slightly more pressure to the hold. Snake and Diesel were getting up slowly, both looking much less confident now. James kept Twitch pinned while watching the other two. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to leave. Tell Razor this stops now. Next time, I won't be so gentle." He released Twitch, who scrambled away, holding his arm. The three bikers backed off, no longer trying to act tough. As they got on their bikes, Snake pointed at James. "This isn't over, soldier boy. Nobody messes with the Harbor Kings." James watched them right away, then pulled out his phone and called Mike. "Mike, check container 247B tomorrow morning. I think we'll find something interesting inside." He knew the gang wouldn't have tried to break in unless there was something valuable in that container. As James finished his patrol, he felt no satisfaction from the fight. In the military, he had learned that violence was always the last resort. But he had also learned that sometimes you had to show strength to prevent greater violence later. The Harbor Kings had tested him tonight, and he had shown them he wasn't just another security guard they could push around. The morning after the confrontation, James Cooper arrived at work to find his car covered in red spray paint. The Harbor King's crown symbol was painted on the hood, and the words, "Dead Man," were sprayed across both doors. Several workers stood nearby, whispering among themselves. Sarah, his sister, rushed out of the office building when she heard about the vandalism. "James, this is getting serious," she said, her face filled with worry. "Maybe we should call the police." James shook his head as he took photos of the damage with his phone. "Not yet. We need more evidence." He had learned in Afghanistan that acting too quickly could sometimes make a situation worse. "How's Bobby Chen doing?" "He quit this morning," Sarah replied quietly. "Left a note saying his family needs him somewhere else. That's the fourth worker this week." Inside his office, James pinned the photos of his car to a large map of the dockyard he had created on the wall. Red pins marked locations where the Harbor Kings had been spotted, and yellow pins showed which workers were possibly working with them. The pattern was becoming clearer. The gang was slowly taking over the night shift operations. Mike Williams walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You really stirred up the hornet's nest last night, boss," he said, handing 1 cup to James. "Word is Razor's furious. Nobody's ever stood up to his men like that before." James sipped his coffee while studying the map. "What did you find in container 247B? "Empty now," Mike replied. "But we found traces of something that shouldn't have been there. The dogs from K9 Security got really excited about that container. Whatever was in there, it wasn't legal cargo." Around noon, James received a text message from an unknown number. "Your sister works late tonight. Shame if something happened to her." His hands tightened around the phone, but his face remained calm. This wasn't the first time he'd dealt with threats to family. The Taliban had tried similar tactics. He called Sarah into his office. "I want you to take a few days off," he said, showing her the text. "Visit Mom in Seattle." Sarah started to protest, but James cut her off. "This isn't a discussion, sis. I've seen this kind of escalation before. They're trying to get to me through you. Please, just do this for me." After making sure Sarah was safely on her way to Seattle, James continued his investigation. He installed small cameras in hidden locations around the dockyard, making sure they covered the areas where the gang usually operated. He also began wearing a body camera during his patrols. Everything had to be documented. That evening, as James walked through the container yard, he found messages spray-painted on various containers. "Get out, soldier boy, and Kings own this yardie." But these weren't just threats, they were markers. The gang was showing him their territory, trying to intimidate him. Around midnight, 4 motorcycles roared past the security office, their riders shouting threats and throwing bottles. James watched them through his window, noting each bike and rider. He recognized Snake, his ribs probably still sore from their fight, riding at the back of the group. The next morning, James discovered all the security cameras in Section C had been smashed. As he inspected the damage, he found a note nailed to a wooden post. "Last chance, soldier. Walk away or we bring war to your doorstep." James took down the note and added it to his evidence wall. The Harbor Kings were used to security guards who could be scared away or bought off. They didn't understand that they were dealing with someone different, someone who had faced real war and wasn't afraid of their threats. He picked up his phone and called an old army buddy who now worked at the Port Authority. "Tom, remember when you said you owed me a favor? I need some information about cargo movements in the last 6 months. Something big is happening at my dockyard, and I need to know what I'm really dealing with." As he hung up the phone, James knew the gang's next move would be bigger. They had tried threats, intimidation, and vandalism. None of it had worked. Now they would try to prove their power, probably with violence. But James was ready. He had spent 15 years preparing for situations like this. 3 nights after sending his sister to Seattle, James Cooper sat in his security office, studying the dockyard's security camera feeds. The clock showed 1:30 a.m., and something didn't feel right. Years of military experience had taught him to trust his instincts. The radio on his desk crackled. "Chief, this is Torres. We've got a problem at Substation B. All the lights in Section 7 just went dark." James checked his monitors. Sure enough, an entire section of the dockyard had gone black. He grabbed his flashlight and radio. "I'll check it out." "Torres, stay at your post." "Mike, what's your position?" Static answered him. James tried again. "Mike, do you copy?" Nothing but silence. Now he was certain. This was a setup. He did a quick equipment check. Flashlight, radio, body camera, and the collapsible baton on his belt. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to never walk into a potential ambush unprepared. He also sent a quick text to his contact at the Port Authority. "Possible situation at Dockyard. Stand by." The night air was cold as James walked toward Section 7. His boots made no sound. He had learned to walk silently during his combat training. The darkness didn't bother him. He had spent countless nights on patrol in much darker places. As he approached Substation B, he heard the familiar sound of motorcycles in the distance. Not the loud roar they usually made, but a low purr. They were trying to be quiet tonight. James counted the sounds. At least 6 or 7 bikes. The substation door was open, its lock broken. Inside, James found the main breaker switched off. This wasn't an accident or malfunction. Someone had cut the power deliberately, and that someone wanted him here. His radio crackled again, but this time it was Razor's voice. "Looking a bit dark out there, soldier boy. Need some help finding your way?" Laughter followed the message. They had taken control of the radio system. James switched off his radio. He didn't need it now. He knew exactly what was happening. The Harbor Kings had planned this carefully. Cut the power, isolate him, then trap him in the darkest part of the dockyard. Moving between the containers, James heard footsteps. The gang members were trying to surround him. He counted at least 7 different sets of boots. In the darkness, he caught glimpses of leather jackets and the glint of weapons, chains, bats, maybe even a knife or 2. come out, soldier boy." Snake's voice echoed between the containers. "No more playing security guard tonight. We're gonna teach you what happens when you mess with the kings." James stayed silent, using the darkness to his advantage. The gang members were getting frustrated, their movements becoming less careful. He heard them bumping into containers, cursing in the dark. They weren't trained for this kind of operation. Suddenly, the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the area where James stood. He pressed himself against a container, becoming part of the shadows. The light passed by without finding him. "Where is he?" someone whispered loudly. "Razor said he'd be here." "Spread out," Snake ordered. "He's here somewhere. Find him." James watched as the gang members separated, making their biggest mistake. In the military, he had learned that splitting up in enemy territory was asking for trouble. These men were used to intimidating unarmed security guards, not facing a trained soldier. The trap they had set for James was about to become his advantage. He knew this section of the dockyard perfectly. Every container, every corner, every shadow. The gang members were now walking through his territory, not theirs. As James moved silently through the darkness, he heard Razor's voice again, closer this time. "Remember, boys, we want him alive. Razor wants to handle this personally." James checked his watch. Nearly 2 a.m. The night shift would be busy in other sections. Nobody would hear anything from this dark corner of the dockyard. Whatever was going to happen would happen here in the next few minutes. He took a deep breath, just like he used to before combat operations. The Harbor Kings thought they were hunting him. They had it backward. In the darkness between the containers, they were about to learn a hard lesson about picking the wrong target. In the pitch-dark dockyard, James Cooper heard one of the bikers getting close to his position. The gang member was breathing heavily, swinging a chain nervously as he walked. James recognized him as Twitch from his edgy movements. "Come on, man," Twitch muttered to himself. "Where are you hiding?" James moved like a shadow, just as he had done during night operations in Afghanistan. He came up behind Twitch silently. In one smooth motion, he grabbed the chain-wielding hand and clamped his other hand over Twitch's mouth. "Quiet," James whispered, "or this gets worse." Twitch struggled for a moment, then went still as James applied pressure to his wrist, making him drop the chain. Using zip ties he kept in his pocket, James secured Twitch's hands and feet, then gagged him with a handkerchief. 1 down, 6 to go. "Twitch, where are you?" Snake's voice echoed between the containers. "Report in." James moved to his next position, staying in the shadows. His body camera was recording everything, each move, each encounter. 2 more gang members appeared, walking side by side with baseball bats. They were making this too easy. Using a small stone, James threw it against a distant container. The sound echoed in the darkness. "Over there," one biker shouted, and both men ran toward the noise. As they passed his hiding spot, James struck. He tackled the first biker, using his momentum to throw the man into his partner. Both gang members went down hard. Before they could recover, James had them subdued and zip-tied like Twitch. Their surprised faces showed they couldn't believe how quickly it had happened. "Something's wrong." Snake's voice was closer now. "Find Twitch and the others." James checked his surroundings. 4 more to go, including Snake and Razor. He could hear them moving, getting nervous. The hunters were realizing they had become the hunted. Suddenly, a flashlight beam caught him. "There!" someone shouted. 2 bikers charged at him, one with a knife, the other with a metal pipe. James didn't retreat. He moved forward, surprising them. He locked the pipe with his forearm, exactly as he'd been trained. The shock traveled through his arm, but he ignored it. His other hand caught the knife wielder's wrist, twisting sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as the man yelled in pain. James knocked the pipe wielder off balance with a sweep of his leg, then threw the knife wielder over his hip. Both men hit the ground hard. Before they could get up, he had them secured like the others. "What's happening?" Razor's angry voice cut through the darkness. "Snake, where is everyone?" "They're a little tied up," James called out, his voice calm and clear. "Just you and Snake left, Razor. Want to rethink your plan?" A gunshot rang out, the bullet hitting a container near James. He ducked and rolled, finding cover. This was new. They had brought a gun. In the flash of the shot, he had seen Snake holding a small revolver. "Not so tough now, are you, soldier boy?" Snake laughed nervously. "Come out where we can see you." James stayed silent, moving between containers. He had dealt with armed enemies before. Snake was no trained shooter. His hands would be shaking, especially in the dark. Another shot rang out, far from where James was. They were shooting blindly now, getting desperate. 5 shots left, James counted. The revolver would only have 6 rounds. He circled around behind them, using the sound of their voices as a guide. Snake and Razor were standing back to back, trying to cover all angles. Snake's gun hand was trembling, just as James had predicted. "This isn't worth it," Razor said quietly to Snake. "We need to get out of here." Before they could move, James emerged from the shadows. His kick sent the gun flying from Snake's hand. Snake tried to throw a punch, but James blocked it and countered with a strike to the throat. Snake dropped, gasping for air. Razor turned to run, but James caught his jacket and threw him against a container. The gang leader slumped to the ground, all his bravado gone. "The Harbor Kings are finished here," James said, securing them both with zip ties. He picked up Snake's gun and emptied the bullets. "Your territory days are over." The lights in Section 7 suddenly flickered back to life. James Cooper stood among the captured Harbor Kings members, his body camera still recording. Mike Williams appeared around the corner with 2 other security guards, all looking surprised at the scene before them. "Sorry for going dark on the radio, boss," Mike said, holding up his radio. "These guys had someone jamming our signals. We found him hiding in the security office and got the power back on." Behind Mike, 2 guards were escorting a handcuffed man in a leather jacket. James nodded, keeping his eyes on Razor and Snake. The gang leaders sat on the ground, their hands secured behind their backs. Snake's nose was bleeding, and Razor had lost his usual confident smirk. Around them, 5 other gang members were also restrained, looking defeated. "You have no idea what you've done," Razor spat out, trying to sound threatening despite his position. "We've got connections. Important people rely on our services. This isn't over, soldier boy." James crouched down in front of Razor, his voice calm but firm. "Let me tell you what I know," he said. "In the past 6 months, cargo worth millions has disappeared from this dockyard. You've been using threatened workers to move illegal goods through legitimate shipments." Razor's face showed surprise. James continued, "My friend at the Port Authority has been tracking unusual cargo patterns. Tonight's evidence will be enough to shut down your whole operation." Snake tried to stand up, but James pushed him back down with one hand. "Sit down. The police are already on their way." In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching the dockyard. James took out his phone and called his sister. "Sarah, it's over. You can come back to work tomorrow. The Harbor Kings won't be a problem anymore." Police cars began arriving, their blue and red lights flashing across the container walls. Detective Martinez, a tough-looking woman in plain clothes, stepped out of the first car. James had been sharing information with her for weeks, building a case against the gang. "Quite a night, Mr. Cooper," Martinez said, surveying the scene. "Looks like you got us exactly what we needed." She turned to her officers. "Get these men in the cars. We've got a lot of questions for them." As the police led the gang members away, Razor turned to James one last time. "You think this makes you a hero? We're just one small part of something bigger. They'll send others." James watched silently as Razor was put into a police car. He knew the gang leader was probably right. Organized crime wouldn't give up a profitable operation easily. But that was a problem for another day. Mike approached with a cup of coffee. "Boss, you need to see this," he said, leading James to container 247B, the same one the gang had tried to break into earlier. "We found their backup phones and documents inside. Looks like they were trying to clean out their evidence when you caught them." Inside the container, police technicians were photographing boxes of paperwork, burner phones, and what looked like shipping manifests. Detective Martinez was grinning as she flipped through the documents. "This is gold, Cooper," she said. "Names, dates, contact numbers." Razor wasn't just running a local operation. They were part of a larger smuggling network. "With this evidence, we can track down their entire organization." The sky was beginning to lighten as James finished giving his statement to the police. His body camera footage would be crucial evidence in building the case against the Harbor Kings. The night shift workers gathered around, many of them looking relieved that the gang's reign of terror was finally over. Mr. Peterson, the head of security, arrived early after hearing the news. He looked at the police cars, the evidence being collected, and then at James. "When we hired you," he said, shaking his head in amazement, "we just wanted someone to tighten up security. We never expected all this." James smiled slightly. "Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. I learned that in the military." As the sun rose over the dockyard, James watched the last police car drive away. The Harbor Kings had thought they were dealing with a simple security guard, someone they could frighten or bribe. Instead, they had faced a soldier who had learned his lessons in one of the toughest places on earth. Their mistake had cost them everything. A week after the Harbor King's arrest, the Portland Dockyard was running smoother than ever. James Cooper sat in his office, reviewing security reports when Detective Martinez walked in, carrying a thick file folder. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said, dropping the folder on his desk. "The Harbor Kings are finished. Razor and Snake both took plea deals. They're giving up names of everyone involved in their smuggling operation." James opened the folder and studied the documents inside. The investigation had uncovered a massive criminal network. The Harbor Kings weren't just smuggling drugs, they were moving stolen cars, illegal weapons, and counterfeit goods through the port. "We've arrested 12 corrupt dock workers so far," Martinez continued. "And here's something interesting. Remember Bobby Chen, the worker who quit? He's been working with us the whole time, gathering evidence from the inside. He was scared for his family, but he wanted to help stop them." Just then, Sarah knocked on the door. She had returned to work the day after the arrests, and the dockyard office felt complete again with her back. "James, there's someone here to see you," she said, smiling. "It's Bobby." Bobby Chen walked in, looking more relaxed than James had ever seen him. "Mr. Cooper," he said, extending his hand. "I wanted to thank you personally. My family can finally sleep at night without worrying about those thugs." James shook Bobby's hand firmly. "You took a big risk helping the police," he said. "That took courage." "Not as much courage as facing 7 of them in the dark." Bobby laughed. "The whole dockyard's talking about that night. Nobody can believe one man took down the entire Harbor Kings gang." Detective Martinez gathered her files. "The Port Authority is implementing new security measures based on what happened here. They're using your dockyard as a model for others. You've started something bigger than you know, Cooper." After they left, James walked out to inspect the dockyard. The morning sun made the water glitter, and the sound of workers going about their jobs filled the air. There was no more graffiti on the containers, no more nervous glances from the workers, no more motorcycles prowling the perimeter. Mike joined him on his walk. "You know what's funny, boss?" he said. "The Harbor Kings thought they were so tough, terrorizing ordinary workers, but they never faced someone who knew real combat. They brought street fighting to a military fight." James nodded. His experiences in Afghanistan had taught him that true strength wasn't about intimidation or violence. It was about protecting others and standing up for what's right. Mr. Peterson called an all-staff meeting that afternoon. The large meeting room was packed with workers from every shift. "As you all know," Peterson began, "last week's events have led to big changes. The Port Authority was so impressed with how we handled the situation that they've approved a complete security upgrade for our facility." He turned to James. "Mr. Cooper, would you like to explain the new measures?" James stood up and addressed the room. "We're installing a state-of-the-art camera system, improving lighting throughout the yard, and implementing new check-in procedures. But the most important change is this: we're creating a worker safety program. If anyone ever tries to threaten or bribe you again, you'll have a direct line to security and police." The workers applauded. Many of them had lived in fear of the Harbor Kings for months, afraid to speak up. Now they could see a real change happening. After the meeting, James returned to his office and looked at the map on his wall. The red pins marking gang activity were gone now. In their place were blue pins showing new security cameras and lighting positions. Sarah brought him a cup of coffee. "You know what Mom said when I told her everything?" She smiled. She said, "That's my James. Always fighting the good fight, even when he's not in uniform anymore." James smiled back at his sister. The military had trained him to be a warrior, but it had also taught him to be a protector. The Harbor Kings had seen the warrior and thought they could break him. They never understood that his real strength came from being a protector. someone who would stand between danger and those who couldn't defend themselves. The dockyard was secure now, but James knew there would always be new challenges. He was ready for them. After all, that's what soldiers do. They adapt, overcome, and protect, whether they're in a war zone or a dockyard in Portland. 3 months after the Harbor Kings incident, James Cooper stood at the dockyard's main gate, watching the morning shift arrive. The changes were obvious to anyone who knew the place before. New security cameras gleamed in the sunlight, improved lighting systems lined the container rows, and workers walked with confidence instead of fear. The local newspaper had run a big story about the Harbor Kings case last week. Razor and his gang had received long prison sentences for their crimes. The article mentioned James, calling him the soldier who cleaned up the dockyard, but he hadn't given any interviews. He preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Morning, boss, called Torres, one of his security guards, driving past in a new patrol vehicle. The Port Authority had increased their security budget significantly after the gang's arrest. James now had a team of 15 guards, all properly trained and equipped. Mike Williams walked up, carrying 2 cups of coffee as usual. "You'll never guess who I just saw in custody downtown," he said, handing James a cup. "Snake." He was trying to get his sentence reduced by offering more information. "Looks like prison life isn't agreeing with him." James sipped his coffee. "Any useful information?" "Actually, yes," Mike replied. He revealed connections to 3 other ports along the coast. Detective Martinez says they're planning raids this week. The whole smuggling network is falling apart. Sarah came out of the office building, waving some papers. "James, you need to see these," she said excitedly. "The worker safety program is showing amazing results. Reports of attempted bribes or threats are down to 0. And look at this. Worker satisfaction is up 85% from last year." The dockyard had become a model for other ports. Security experts from different cities often visited to study their procedures. James had even been asked to help train security teams at other facilities, though he preferred staying at his own post. Bobby Chen, now promoted to shift supervisor, approached with a group of new workers. "Mr. Cooper, would you mind saying a few words to our new employees? They've heard all the stories about what happened here." James looked at the fresh faces, all eager to hear from him. He usually avoided talking about that night, but these people deserved to understand their workplace's history. 3 months ago, he began, this dockyard was under the control of criminals who thought fear and violence gave them power. They were wrong. Real strength isn't about intimidation. It's about standing together and protecting each other. That's what we do here now. The new workers nodded, impressed by his words. One young man raised his hand. "Is it true you took down 7 bikers in the dark by yourself?" James shook his head. "I wasn't by myself. I had support from brave workers like Bobby, who risked everything to help gather evidence. I had backup from dedicated officers like Detective Martinez. And I had my security team, who worked tirelessly to protect this place." Later that day, Mr. Peterson called James into his office. "The Port Authority is promoting me to regional director," he said. "And they want you to take my position as head of dockyard operations." James was surprised. "Sir, I'm just a security supervisor." Peterson laughed. "You're much more than that, Cooper. You didn't just stop a gang. You transformed this place. The workers trust you, the authorities respect you, and you understand both security and operations. Think about it." That evening, as the sun set over the water, James walked through the dockyard. Container ships were being loaded and unloaded, crews worked efficiently, and security patrols moved smoothly through their routes. Everything was running as it should. His phone buzzed. A message from his mother. "Saw the newspaper article. Your father would be so proud. He always said you had a guardian's heart, even as a soldier." James smiled, remembering his father's words before his first deployment. "A warrior protects, son. That's what makes the uniform mean something." The Harbor Kings had seen him as just another obstacle to remove. They never understood that his military training wasn't just about fighting. It was about leadership, protection, and building something worth defending. As night fell and the dockyard lights came on, James watched his team begin their evening patrols. The old shadows were gone, replaced by something stronger than fear, a community that stood together, protected each other, and proved that one person standing up for what's right could change everything.